Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her classmates spent their afternoons at the mall or gossiping about boys, she was at the local gym, throwing punches at heavy bags and learning combat techniques from her Uncle Miguel, a former Marine. Her father had died in a car accident when she was 12, and her mother worked double shifts at the hospital to make ends meet. Uncle Miguel became the father figure she needed, and he saw something special in Sarah that others missed. At 19, Sarah stood 5 feet 6 inches tall with lean muscle earned through years of disciplined training. Her dark hair was usually pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her brown eyes held an intensity that made people take notice. She had learned mixed martial arts, boxing, and military combat techniques from Miguel, who believed that a woman needed to know how to protect herself in a dangerous world. What started as basic self-defense lessons had evolved into something much more serious. Sarah worked at a small diner on Highway 35, a place that served truckers, travelers, and locals. The roadside cafe was nothing special to look at, with its faded yellow paint and cracked parking lot, but it was honest work that helped her save money for college. She had dreams of becoming a nurse like her mother, but those dreams seemed far away when every paycheck went toward helping with household expenses. The diner attracted all kinds of people, and Sarah had learned to read customers quickly. She could spot trouble before it started, whether it was a drunk trucker getting too friendly or teenagers looking to cause problems. Her boss, Frank, an elderly man with kind eyes, appreciated her ability to handle difficult situations without calling the police. Sarah had a calm presence that could diffuse tension, but beneath that calm exterior was someone prepared for anything. On the morning of March 15th, Sarah arrived at work earlier than usual. The spring air was crisp and the sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon. She unlocked the diner and began her opening routine, starting the coffee machines and prepping for the breakfast rush. The familiar sounds of the kitchen coming to life were comforting to her. Frank would arrive in an hour, followed by the other waitress, Linda, but for now, Sarah enjoyed the quiet moments before the day began. As she wiped down tables and arranged the chairs, Sarah noticed a black SUV with tinted windows parked across the street. It had been there when she arrived, which was unusual since most travelers stopped for gas or food and then moved on. Something about the vehicle made her uneasy, though she couldn't explain why. Her uncle had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, those instincts were telling her to pay attention. The morning progressed normally at first. Regular customers came in for their usual coffee and breakfast orders. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived nearby, stopped by for her daily cup of tea and slice of pie. Tom, a construction worker, grabbed his large coffee and breakfast sandwich before heading to the job site. These familiar faces made Sarah feel more at ease, but she kept glancing at the black SUV, which hadn't moved. Around 10 o'clock, the breakfast rush had died down, and only a few customers remained in the diner. Frank was in the back office doing paperwork and Linda was cleaning tables. Sarah was behind the counter refilling the coffee machines when she heard the bell above the door chime. She looked up to see 5 men entering the diner, and immediately, every alarm bell in her head started ringing. The men were dressed casually, but there was something coordinated about their movements that didn't feel natural. They were all wearing dark clothing and baseball caps pulled low over their faces. The leader, a tall man with broad shoulders and cold blue eyes, scanned the diner like he was mapping out every exit and counting every person inside. The other 4 men spread out slightly, positioning themselves in a way that blocked the main entrance and the view from outside. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She continued her task of refilling the coffee machine, but her senses were now heightened to everything happening around her. She noticed that one of the men had a slight bulge under his jacket that suggested a concealed weapon. Another kept checking his watch as if they were working on a timeline. The way they moved, the way they communicated with subtle glances, told her these weren't random travelers stopping for breakfast. The leader approached the counter where Sarah was working. His smile was cold and didn't reach his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried an underlying threat that made Sarah's blood run cold. He ordered coffee for his group, but the way he said it made it clear that coffee wasn't what they were really there for. Sarah nodded and began preparing their order, her mind racing as she tried to figure out what these men wanted and how she could protect the innocent people in the diner. As she poured the coffee, Sarah caught a glimpse of Frank through the service window. He was still in his office, unaware of what was happening in the main dining area. Linda was wiping down a table near the back of the restaurant, also oblivious to the danger. Mrs. Henderson was finishing her pie at a corner booth, and Tom had left a few minutes earlier. There were two other customers, a young couple sharing breakfast at a window table, completely absorbed in their conversation. The leader leaned against the counter, his presence intimidating. He began asking questions that seemed innocent on the surface but felt like he was gathering information. He wanted to know when the diner got busy, how many people worked there, and whether there were security cameras. Sarah answered his questions carefully, giving vague responses while her mind worked on a plan. She realized that whatever these men were planning, she might be the only thing standing between them and innocent people getting hurt. Her uncle's voice echoed in her memory from countless training sessions. He had always told her that the best defense was being prepared, staying calm and acting decisively when the moment came. Sarah had never imagined she would need to use her skills in a real-life threatening situation. But as she looked at the 5 dangerous men spreading throughout the diner, she knew that moment had arrived. She just had to wait for the right opportunity to act. The tension in the diner grew thicker as the minutes passed. Sarah served the coffee to the 5 men, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The leader, who seemed to be in charge, took a sip and nodded approvingly, but his eyes never left Sarah's face. She could feel him studying her, trying to determine if she would be a problem or just another scared waitress who would do whatever they asked. The other 4 men had positioned themselves strategically throughout the diner. One sat near the front door, another by the emergency exit in the back, and 2 more at tables that gave them clear views of the entire restaurant. They weren't eating or drinking much, just watching and waiting. Sarah realized they were professionals, not random criminals looking for a quick score. This was planned, organized, and that made them much more dangerous. Sarah's mind raced through the training scenarios Uncle Miguel had put her through. He had always emphasized the importance of situational awareness and knowing your environment. She mentally cataloged everything that could be used as a weapon or advantage. Behind the counter, there were several kitchen knives, a heavy coffee pot, and the cash register that could provide cover. The diner's layout worked in her favor because the counter area gave her multiple angles of attack and several escape routes. Mrs. Henderson finished her pie and stood to leave, but the man near the front door politely suggested she sit back down and wait a few minutes. His tone was friendly, but the message was clear. No one was leaving. The elderly woman looked confused but complied, sensing something was wrong. The young couple at the window table continued their conversation, still unaware of the danger surrounding them. Frank emerged from his office carrying a clipboard and preparing to check on the dining room. Sarah caught his eye and gave him a subtle shake of her head, a signal they had developed over months of working together. When difficult customers were in the restaurant, Frank paused, his experienced eyes quickly taking in the unusual atmosphere. He had run the diner for 20 years and had seen enough trouble to recognize it when it walked through his door. The leader finished his coffee and approached the counter again. This time his friendly facade began to slip. He leaned forward and spoke in a low voice that only Sarah could hear. He told her that they weren't there to hurt anyone, but they needed her cooperation. They wanted access to the safe in the office and any cash from the register. If everyone stayed calm and did exactly what they were told, no one would get hurt. Sarah nodded as if she understood and was willing to comply, but her mind was already working on a different plan. She had noticed that despite their professional appearance, these men had made several small mistakes. They had positioned themselves well for controlling the customers, but they hadn't accounted for someone who might fight back. They assumed that a young waitress in a small-town diner would be too scared and inexperienced to pose a threat. The leader gestured for Frank to come over, and her boss approached the counter with his hands visible and his expression calm. Frank was a Vietnam veteran who had seen real combat, and Sarah could tell by his body language that he was also assessing the situation. The leader explained what he wanted, speaking quietly to avoid alarming the customers. Frank nodded and said he would cooperate, but Sarah caught a slight glance he gave toward the kitchen area where they kept an old baseball bat. As Frank moved toward the office to access the safe, Sarah realized this was her best opportunity. The men were focused on the money, and their attention was divided between watching Frank and controlling the customers. The leader was standing close to the counter, within striking distance. 2 of his men were seated with their backs partially turned to her. and the other two were far enough away that she might be able to deal with the immediate threats before they could react. Sarah's training had taught her that in a multiple opponent situation, speed and surprise were everything. She needed to disable the closest threats quickly and use their own numbers against them. The cramped space of the diner actually worked in her favor because it would limit their ability to use weapons effectively and force them to come at her one at a time. The leader was growing impatient as Frank took his time opening the safe. He turned back to Sarah and made a comment about hoping she was smart enough to keep her mouth shut about what had happened here. That was his mistake. He had assumed she was just a scared witness to manage, not a threat to eliminate. His overconfidence would be his downfall. Sarah began moving casually behind the counter, positioning herself near the coffee station where she would have access to both hot liquid and improvised weapons. She picked up a fresh pot of coffee, ostensibly to offer refills but really to get herself in the right position. The ceramic pot was heavy and the coffee inside was nearly boiling, making it an effective weapon in the right hands. The man sitting nearest to the counter was checking his phone, probably watching for some kind of signal or timing. He had relaxed slightly as the operation seemed to be going smoothly. The others were maintaining their positions but had also settled into a more comfortable posture, now that they believed they had full control of the situation. Frank called out from the office that the safe was being difficult, buying Sarah a few more precious seconds. She could see the leader growing more agitated, which meant he might make another mistake. Agitated people made poor decisions, and poor decisions created opportunities for someone who knew how to exploit them. Sarah took a deep breath and centered herself the way Uncle Miguel had taught her. She thought about all those hours of training, all those scenarios they had practiced, all those times he had told her that size and numbers didn't matter if you were faster, smarter, and more determined than your opponents. She thought about her mother working long shifts at the hospital, about Frank who had given her a chance when other employers wouldn't, about Mrs. Henderson and the young couple who had no idea how much danger they were in. The leader stepped closer to the counter, his patience finally running out. He reached inside his jacket and Sarah knew that whatever was about to happen, it had to happen now. Her window of opportunity was closing fast, and once these men decided to escalate the situation, innocent people would get hurt. She couldn't let that happen. It was time to show them that they had made a serious mistake in underestimating a small-town waitress who happened to be one of the most dangerous people they would ever meet. The moment the leader reached inside his jacket, Sarah's training took over completely. Time seemed to slow down as her body moved with practiced precision. She gripped the handle of the scalding coffee pot and swung it in a perfect arc toward the leader's face. The hot ceramic connected with his temple with a sickening crack, and boiling coffee splashed across his head and shoulders. He screamed in pain and stumbled backward, temporarily blinded and disoriented. Before the coffee pot had even finished its swing, Sarah was already moving toward her second target. The man sitting closest to the counter was just beginning to react to his leader's scream when Sarah vaulted over the counter with the fluid grace of someone who had practiced this movement hundreds of times. Her feet connected with his chest in a devastating drop kick that sent him crashing backward over his chair. The impact drove all the air from his lungs and left him gasping on the floor. The third man, who had been positioned near the window, was reaching for something under his jacket when Sarah landed and immediately rolled toward him. She came up from her roll with a powerful uppercut that caught him perfectly under the chin. The force of the blow lifted him off his feet and sent him sprawling across the table where the young couple had been sitting. They screamed and dove for cover as dishes and coffee cups exploded around them. By this point, only 8 seconds had passed since Sarah's first move, but the diner had erupted into chaos. The man who had been guarding the back exit was running toward the action, pulling a weapon from his jacket. Sarah spotted him in her peripheral vision and grabbed a heavy ceramic plate from the table. She hurled it with perfect accuracy, striking him in the forehead and sending him tumbling into a booth. The plate shattered on impact and he slumped unconscious against the vinyl seating. The fifth and final man had been stationed near the front door, and he was now the only threat still standing. He had managed to draw his weapon, but the cramped confines of the diner and the chaos around him made it difficult to get a clear shot without risking hitting his own men or innocent customers. Sarah recognized his hesitation and used it against him. She grabbed a metal napkin dispenser from a nearby table and hurled it at the overhead light fixture directly above the gunman. The impact shattered the fluorescent bulb and plunged that section of the diner into relative darkness. Glass and sparks rained down on the man, causing him to flinch and momentarily lose sight of his target. Sarah used those precious seconds to close the distance between them. She moved in a zigzag pattern using overturned chairs and tables as cover. The gunman fired once, but the shot went wild, embedding itself in the wall behind where Sarah had been a split second earlier. Before he could fire again, Sarah was on him. She tackled him low, driving her shoulder into his midsection and wrapping her arms around his waist. The impact sent both of them crashing through the front door of the diner. They tumbled onto the concrete sidewalk outside, with Sarah landing on top. The gun skittered away across the pavement, spinning under a parked car. The man tried to buck Sarah off, but she had learned ground fighting techniques from Uncle Miguel, who had studied Brazilian jiu-jitsu during his military service. She quickly transitioned to a submission hold, wrapping her arm around his throat in a rear naked choke. The man struggled frantically, but Sarah had positioned herself perfectly. Within seconds, his struggles became weaker, and then he went limp as the blood flow to his brain was cut off. Sarah held the choke for a few extra seconds to ensure he was completely unconscious, then released him and quickly stood up. She looked back through the shattered door of the diner to assess the situation inside. The leader was still on the ground, holding his burned and bleeding face. The man she had drop-kicked was trying to sit up but appeared to have trouble breathing. The one she had uppercut was motionless across the table. The fourth man remained unconscious in the booth, where he had fallen. The entire confrontation had lasted exactly 83 seconds from the moment Sarah threw the coffee pot to the moment the last man lost consciousness on the sidewalk. 5 dangerous criminals had been completely neutralized by a 19-year-old waitress who weighed less than 140 pounds. They had never seen it coming because they had underestimated her so completely. Frank emerged from the office, having heard the commotion but wisely staying out of the way during the fight. His eyes were wide with amazement as he took in the scene. Mrs. Henderson was peeking out from behind an overturned table, her face pale but her eyes sharp with admiration. The young couple was huddled together near the window, shaken but unharmed. Sarah quickly surveyed the diner for any weapons the men might have dropped. She found 2 handguns and a knife, which she carefully collected and placed behind the counter out of reach. Her breathing was elevated from the exertion, but she was completely in control. The training had worked exactly as Uncle Miguel had promised it would. The leader was trying to get to his feet, his face a mess of burns and cuts from the coffee pot impact. Sarah calmly walked over to him and placed her foot on his chest, pushing him back down to the floor. She told him in a steady voice that he and his friends should stay exactly where they were until the police arrived. Her tone was calm and professional, without a trace of the fear or panic he might have expected from someone who had just been in a life-or-death fight. Frank was already on the phone with 911, reporting the attempted robbery and requesting both police and medical assistance. Sarah checked on each of the customers to make sure they were uninjured, her manner shifting immediately from dangerous fighter to caring waitress. She helped Mrs. Henderson to a chair and brought the young couple some water to help with their shock. As sirens began to wail in the distance, Sarah looked out at the black SUV across the street. The vehicle was still there, but she could see movement inside. There might be more of them, a getaway driver or additional backup. She mentioned this to Frank, who relayed the information to the 911 dispatcher. The last thing they needed was for more criminals to arrive and complicate the situation. Sarah remained vigilant as they waited for the police, keeping an eye on the 5 unconscious or semi-conscious men scattered around the diner. She had done exactly what Uncle Miguel had trained her to do, protecting innocent people and neutralizing threats quickly and efficiently. But she also knew that the real test would come next, when she had to explain to the authorities how a teenage waitress had single-handedly defeated 5 armed criminals in less than 90 seconds. The first police car arrived within minutes, followed quickly by 2 more patrol vehicles and an ambulance. Sheriff Tom Bradley, a 20-year veteran of law enforcement, stepped through the shattered door of the diner and stopped short at the scene before him. 5 men were scattered around the restaurant in various states of consciousness, while a young waitress calmly swept up broken glass near the counter. It wasn't what he had expected to find when dispatch reported an attempted robbery. Sarah looked up as Sheriff Bradley approached, her expression calm and respectful. She had dealt with law enforcement before during her uncle's military events and community programs, so she knew how to conduct herself professionally. She set aside the broom and walked over to meet the sheriff, her hands visible and her movements deliberate to avoid any misunderstandings. Sheriff Bradley was a tall man with graying hair and kind eyes that had seen plenty of trouble in his years of service. He looked around the diner, taking in the overturned furniture, the unconscious men, and the weapons Sarah had collected behind the counter. His deputies were already securing the scene and checking on the injured criminals, but his attention was focused on understanding exactly what had happened. Sarah began explaining the events clearly and chronologically, starting with her arrival at work and the suspicious black SUV she had noticed. She described how the 5 men had entered the diner, their threatening behavior and their demand for money from the safe. Sheriff Bradley listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timing and the men's actions. When Sarah reached the part about the actual confrontation, Sheriff Bradley's eyebrows rose slightly. He had dealt with plenty of self-defense cases over the years, but this was unlike anything he had encountered. Sarah described each move she had made with clinical precision, explaining how her training had kicked in and how she had neutralized each threat in sequence. Frank corroborated Sarah's account, describing what he had witnessed from the office and praising her quick thinking and courage. Mrs. Henderson, despite her age, provided a remarkably detailed account of the events from her position near the back of the diner. The young couple, still shaken but grateful to be alive, confirmed that Sarah had undoubtedly saved their lives. The paramedics were working on the 5 criminals, treating various injuries ranging from severe burns on the leader's face to potential concussions and broken bones among the others. None of the injuries appeared to be life-threatening, but all 5 men would need medical attention before they could be properly questioned and processed. Deputy Martinez, a young officer who had recently joined the sheriff's department, approached with information about the black SUV. They had found a 6th man in the vehicle who had attempted to flee when police arrived, but was apprehended 2 blocks away. The SUV contained additional weapons, communication equipment, and what appeared to be detailed surveillance photos of the diner and its employees. Sheriff Bradley's expression grew more serious as he realized the scope of what they were dealing with. This wasn't a random robbery attempt by desperate criminals. The level of planning and equipment suggested these men were part of a larger organization, possibly involved in more serious crimes than simple theft. The fact that they had surveillance photos of the diner's employees was particularly concerning. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about the 5 men's backgrounds. 2 of them had previous arrests for armed robbery, 1 had connections to organized crime in a neighboring state, and another had recently been released from federal prison. This wasn't their first rodeo, which made Sarah's victory even more remarkable. The FBI was contacted due to the interstate nature of the criminals' backgrounds and the possibility that this was part of a larger criminal enterprise. Agent Rebecca Foster, a specialist in organized crime, arrived at the scene within hours. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s with sharp intelligence and extensive experience dealing with professional criminals. Agent Foster was particularly interested in Sarah's background and training. She questioned her extensively about Uncle Miguel's military service and the specific techniques Sarah had learned. The agent seemed impressed but also slightly concerned about a civilian having such advanced combat skills. Sarah explained that her training was purely for self-defense and protection of others, not for aggressive purposes. The interrogation of the captured criminals began once they were medically cleared. Under questioning, they revealed that the diner robbery was supposed to be a simple operation to fund a larger criminal enterprise. They had chosen the roadside cafe because they believed it would be an easy target with minimal resistance and good escape routes along the highway. The leader, whose face bore the permanent scars of his encounter with the coffee pot, was the most forthcoming during questioning. He admitted that they had completely underestimated the situation and had never expected to encounter someone with Sarah's capabilities. Their surveillance had identified her as just another waitress, not as a potential threat to their operation. The 6th man, captured while trying to flee in the SUV, provided additional information about their organization's activities. They were part of a crew that had been hitting small businesses along highway corridors across 3 states. The diner was supposed to be their final score before moving to a new territory, but Sarah's intervention had brought their entire operation to an end. Local news outlets picked up the story quickly, and within hours, reporters were arriving at the scene. The image of a young waitress single-handedly defeating 5 armed criminals captured public imagination. Sarah found herself thrust into an unwanted spotlight, with reporters wanting to interview her and cameras following her everywhere she went. Sheriff Bradley and Agent Foster worked together to manage the media attention while protecting Sarah's privacy. They released a carefully worded statement praising her courage and quick thinking while avoiding details that might compromise the ongoing investigation or put Sarah at risk from the criminal's associates. Uncle Miguel arrived at the diner as soon as he heard the news, his face a mixture of pride and concern. He had trained Sarah to defend herself and others, but he had hoped she would never need to use those skills in such a dangerous situation. Seeing the scene and hearing what had happened, he realized that his training had not only worked but had saved multiple lives. The community response was overwhelming. Frank's Diner, which had been struggling financially, suddenly became famous throughout the region. People drove from hours away just to eat at the place where the waitress warrior had made her stand. Local businesses offered Sarah scholarships and job opportunities, recognizing her character and courage. But for Sarah, the most important outcome was that no innocent people had been hurt. Mrs. Henderson was safe, the young couple was unharmed, and Frank's business was secure. She had done exactly what Uncle Miguel had trained her to do, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. The media attention and public recognition were secondary to knowing she had made the right choice in that crucial moment. As the day wound down and the last of the investigators left the scene, Sarah stood in the restored diner, looking at the repaired windows and replaced furniture. Everything looked normal again, but she knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. She had discovered something about herself that day, something that would change the course of her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. The weeks following the incident brought changes to Sarah's life that she had never anticipated. The story of the waitress who defeated 5 armed criminals in 83 seconds had spread far beyond their small Texas town. News outlets from major cities picked up the story, and social media exploded with videos and commentary about her remarkable feat. Sarah found herself receiving interview requests from television shows, magazines, and documentary filmmakers from around the country. Despite the attention, Sarah tried to maintain her normal routine. She continued working at the diner, though the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Frank's roadside cafe had become a tourist destination, with visitors coming from hundreds of miles away hoping to meet the famous waitress and hear her story firsthand. Frank had to hire additional staff to handle the increased business, and he insisted on giving Sarah a substantial raise and a share of the profits. The constant attention began to wear on Sarah, who had always preferred a quiet life focused on work and training. Reporters camped outside her apartment building, and strangers recognized her everywhere she went. Uncle Miguel became increasingly protective, concerned about her safety and privacy. He had taught her to defend herself, but he hadn't prepared her for the challenge of dealing with fame and public scrutiny. Agent Foster remained in contact with Sarah as the FBI's investigation into the criminal organization continued. The 5 men she had defeated were part of a larger network that had been operating across multiple states for over 2 years. Sarah's intervention had not only stopped their immediate plan but had provided law enforcement with crucial intelligence that led to the arrest of 12 additional criminals in 3 different states. The trial of the 5 men became a media sensation, with Sarah as the star witness. She testified clearly and calmly about the events in the diner, demonstrating some of her techniques for the jury when requested by the prosecution. The defense attorneys tried to portray the criminals as victims of excessive force, but the evidence was overwhelming. The surveillance photos, weapons, and their own confessions made it clear that they had posed a serious threat to innocent people. During the trial, more details emerged about what might have happened if Sarah hadn't intervened. The criminals had planned to rob the diner and then eliminate any witnesses who could identify them. They had done this before in other locations, leaving a trail of violence and trauma. Sarah's quick action had not only saved the money in the safe, but had prevented what could have been a much more tragic outcome. The judge sentenced all 5 men to lengthy prison terms, praising Sarah's courage during the sentencing hearing. He noted that her actions exemplified the best of human nature, the willingness to risk personal safety to protect others. The families of potential victims who might have been hurt in future crimes sent letters thanking Sarah for her bravery. As the legal proceedings concluded, Sarah faced a decision about her future. College scholarship offers poured in from universities across the country, many specifically interested in her unique combination of academic potential and combat skills. Several law enforcement agencies had also approached her about training programs and career opportunities. The military had expressed interest in her abilities as well. Uncle Miguel spent long hours talking with Sarah about her options. He was proud of what she had accomplished, but wanted to ensure she made decisions based on her own dreams, rather than public pressure. He reminded her that fame was temporary, but education and personal growth were lasting. Sarah had always wanted to be a nurse, and he encouraged her not to abandon that dream just because other opportunities had presented themselves. The media attention also brought some unexpected challenges. A few copycat incidents occurred where people tried to recreate Sarah's techniques in inappropriate situations, leading to injuries and legal problems. Some martial arts schools began advertising waitress warrior training programs, exploiting her story for commercial gain. Sarah felt responsible for these developments and worried that her actions had sent the wrong message about violence and conflict resolution. Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who specialized in trauma and heroic behavior, reached out to Sarah to offer support and guidance. She explained that many people who found themselves thrust into the spotlight after heroic acts struggled with the psychological aftermath. The constant retelling of the story, the pressure to be a role model, and the guilt about the violence involved, even though it was justified, could take a toll on mental health. Through her sessions with Dr. Williams, Sarah began to process not just the events of that day, but also her feelings about the aftermath. She realized that she felt guilty about the injuries she had inflicted, even though she knew they were necessary to protect innocent people. The doctor helped her understand that this guilt was normal and actually demonstrated her good character rather than indicating any wrongdoing on her part. Sarah also struggled with the way her story had been sensationalized in some media coverage. Some outlets focused more on the violence and dramatic aspects rather than the protection of innocent people that had motivated her actions. She worried that young people might think violence was glamorous or exciting rather than understanding it as a last resort when all other options had been exhausted. Uncle Miguel arranged for Sarah to speak at local schools and community centers, sharing her story in a more controlled environment where she could emphasize the importance of training, discipline, and using violence only as a last resort to protect others. These speaking engagements helped Sarah feel like she was contributing something positive rather than just being a celebrity for something she had been forced to do. The financial rewards from her newfound fame were substantial but felt awkward to Sarah. Book deals, movie rights, and endorsement opportunities could have made her wealthy, but she struggled with profiting from what had essentially been a traumatic situation. After consulting with Uncle Miguel and Dr. Williams, she decided to donate most of the money to organizations that provided self-defense training to women and supported victims of violent crime. As summer approached, Sarah made her decision about college. She chose a nursing program at a state university that had offered her a full scholarship, staying true to her original dream of following in her mother's footsteps. The university also had an excellent martial arts program where she could continue her training and perhaps help teach others in a structured, positive environment. The announcement of her college choice was met with mixed reactions from the media and public. Some praised her for staying grounded and pursuing her original goals, while others felt she was wasting an opportunity to become a professional fighter or law enforcement officer. Sarah had learned to ignore the criticism and focus on what felt right for her own life and values. On her last day working at the diner before leaving for college, the community organized a celebration in her honor. The event was held in the town square, with speeches from local officials, law enforcement, and Uncle Miguel. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and gratitude from people whose lives she had touched, both directly and indirectly, through her actions that day in March. 5 years later, Sarah Martinez stood in the hallway of Memorial Hospital, adjusting her nurse's uniform and preparing for another shift in the emergency department. She had graduated with honors from nursing school and had quickly earned the respect of her colleagues for her calm demeanor under pressure and her ability to handle difficult situations. Few of her co-workers knew about her past, and Sarah preferred it that way. The media attention had gradually faded as other stories captured public interest, though Sarah occasionally received letters from people thanking her for inspiring them to learn self-defense or pursue careers in law enforcement. She kept these letters in a box at home, reading them when she needed reminding that her actions had made a positive difference in the world. Uncle Miguel had aged gracefully and remained proud of his niece's choices. He continued teaching self-defense classes at the local community center, often using Sarah's story as an example of how proper training and good judgment could save lives. He never revealed her current location or profession to curious visitors, respecting her desire for privacy and normal life. The roadside cafe had become a permanent landmark in their hometown. With a small plaque commemorating the events of that March day, Frank had used the increased business to expand and improve the restaurant, creating a scholarship fund for local students pursuing careers in public service. He stayed in touch with Sarah through occasional phone calls and holiday cards, always asking about her nursing career and expressing his continued gratitude for her courage. Dr. Patricia Williams had become a close mentor and friend to Sarah over the years. Their therapy sessions had evolved into a professional relationship, where Sarah sometimes consulted on cases involving trauma victims who had defended themselves or others. Her unique perspective as someone who had used violence successfully in defense of innocence made her valuable in helping others process similar experiences. On this particular evening at the hospital, Sarah was working the night shift when ambulances began arriving with victims from a multi-car accident on the interstate. The emergency department quickly filled with injured people, and all staff were called to assist with the overwhelming caseload. Sarah moved efficiently between patients, her training allowing her to remain calm and focused, even as chaos surrounded her. Among the patients was a young mother who had been driving with her two small children when a drunk driver crashed into their vehicle. The woman was conscious but terrified about her children's condition. Sarah knelt beside her stretcher and spoke in the same calm, reassuring voice she had used with customers at the diner years earlier. She explained what the doctors were doing to help her children and stayed with her until family members arrived. As Sarah worked through the night, treating patients and comforting families, she reflected on how different her life might have been if she had chosen one of the other paths that opened up after the diner incident. She could have become a professional fighter, a federal agent, or a military officer. But here in the emergency room, she was using her skills to heal rather than to fight, to comfort rather than to defeat. Dr. James Morrison, the emergency department chief, had worked with Sarah for 2 years and considered her one of his best nurses. He had learned about her past through a background check, but had never discussed it with her directly. Tonight, watching her handle the crisis with such competence and compassion, he was reminded of why she was so effective in her role. The same qualities that had made her capable of protecting others through combat now made her exceptional at healing them. Near dawn, as the emergency had subsided and the last patients were being transferred to other departments, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. Agent Rebecca Foster, now promoted to supervisor, had arrived at the hospital looking for her. Sarah was surprised to see the FBI agent after so many years and wondered what could have brought her there. Agent Foster explained that the criminal organization Sarah had helped dismantle 5 years earlier had recently resurfaced under new leadership. They had been targeting the people responsible for their original arrests, seeking revenge for the prison sentences and damaged reputation. Sarah's name was on their list along with Sheriff Bradley, several other law enforcement officers, and some of the witnesses from the trial. The news was sobering but not entirely surprising to Sarah. She had always known that her actions might have long-term consequences, and she had maintained some of the security awareness Uncle Miguel had taught her. Agent Foster assured her that law enforcement was taking the threat seriously and offered to arrange protection, but Sarah declined. She had built a good life and didn't want to disrupt it based on what might happen. Instead, Sarah asked Agent Foster to keep her informed of any specific threats and promised to be more vigilant about her surroundings. She also mentioned that she had continued her training over the years, attending martial arts classes at the university and practicing with Uncle Miguel during visits home. She was different now than she had been 5 years ago, more experienced and mature, but no less capable of protecting herself if necessary. Over the following weeks, Sarah noticed subtle changes in her environment that suggested increased security. Additional police patrols passed by the hospital more frequently, and she occasionally spotted what appeared to be federal agents in the parking garage. She appreciated the protection but hoped it wouldn't be necessary for long. The situation came to a head on a quiet Tuesday evening when Sarah was leaving the hospital after her shift. She had parked in the employee garage and was walking to her car when she noticed that the lighting seemed dimmer than usual. Several bulbs appeared to have been deliberately broken, creating shadows and blind spots throughout the parking area. Sarah's training kicked in immediately. She changed her route to her car, staying in well-lit areas and maintaining awareness of her surroundings. As she approached her vehicle, she spotted two figures moving between the parked cars, attempting to intercept her path. Their movements were coordinated and purposeful, suggesting they were working together with a specific plan. Rather than continuing to her car, Sarah changed direction and headed back toward the hospital entrance. The two figures adjusted their movement to follow her, confirming her suspicions that she was their target. Sarah reached into her purse and pressed the panic button on a personal alarm Uncle Miguel had given her, sending a silent alert to both hospital security and local law enforcement. The hospital security team responded quickly, flooding the garage with additional personnel and bright lights. The two would-be attackers fled immediately, disappearing into the night before they could be apprehended. Sarah provided a detailed description to police and FBI agents who arrived on the scene, but she knew the encounter was likely just the beginning of a larger problem. Agent Foster arrived within an hour, bringing news that similar attempts had been made against other targets on the revenge list. Two retired police officers had been attacked in their homes, though both had survived with injuries. Sheriff Bradley had been approached by suspicious individuals near his ranch, but had also escaped harm. The criminal organization was clearly making good on their threats. The FBI offered to relocate Sarah to a different city with a new identity, but she refused. She had built relationships and a career that mattered to her, and she wasn't willing to abandon everything because of threats from criminals. Instead, she agreed to enhanced security measures and promised to be more careful about her daily routines. As Sarah drove home that night with an FBI escort, she thought about the circular nature of her situation. 5 years earlier, she had used violence to protect innocent people from criminals. Now those same criminals' associates were trying to use violence against her in revenge. The cycle seemed endless, with each act of justice creating new enemies and new threats. But Sarah had learned something important over the years. She had discovered that there were many ways to fight evil and protect people. Sometimes it required the kind of direct action she had taken in the diner, but more often it involved the quieter heroism of healing, teaching, and supporting others. Her work as a nurse had touched hundreds of lives, providing comfort and care to people in their most vulnerable moments. The young woman who had once defeated 5 armed criminals in 83 seconds had evolved into someone who could save lives in different but equally important ways. Sarah Martinez had found her true calling, and no amount of threats or danger would make her abandon the path she had chosen. She was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, confident in her abilities and secure in her purpose.